Picture this. A king stands before the largest army the ancient world has ever seen. Behind him are only a few thousand men. In front of him, perhaps hundreds of thousands. He knows he cannot win. He knows he will die. And yet, he stays. Not because he is reckless, not because he is mad, but because he understands something most people never will, that one moment of courage can outlive an empire. This is not just the story of a battle. This is the story of Leonidas, the Spartan king, who turned certain death into immortal legend. Long before his name echoed through history, Leonidas was born into one of the most brutal societies ever created. This was Sparta, not a city of poets, merchants, or dreamers. Sparta was a machine, a state built for war, a culture where softness was feared, weakness was punished, and discipline was worshipped. To understand Leonidas, we first have to understand the world that shaped him. Sparta was unlike the other Greek city-states. Athens celebrated philosophy, theatre, architecture, and debate. Sparta celebrated endurance, obedience, pain, control. From childhood, Spartan boys were stripped of comfort and trained to become soldiers. They entered the agoge, one of the harshest systems of education in history. There, they learned to fight, to survive, to obey without hesitation, and to endure hunger, cold, and fear. They were not taught to ask, "What do I want?" They were taught to ask, "What does Sparta require of me?" And somewhere inside that unforgiving world, Leonidas was raised. He was born into the royal Agiad dynasty, one of Sparta's two ruling houses. But his path to the throne was never obvious. He was not the eldest son. He was not expected to become king. In fact, that may have been one of the greatest advantages of his life. Because unlike some princes raised with protection and privilege, Leonidas was believed to have gone through the full Spartan training like any other citizen warrior. That matters. It meant he did not merely rule soldiers. He understood them. He had suffered as they suffered. He had been tested as they were tested. And that forged a kind of authority no crown alone could provide. In many ways, Leonidas was the perfect Spartan ideal. Calm under pressure, physically formidable, disciplined, proud, and devoted not to personal glory, but to duty. But history rarely remembers people for the world they inherit. It remembers them for the moment that tests them. And for Leonidas, that moment was coming. Far to the east, an empire was rising with terrifying force. The Persian Empire. Immense, wealthy, sophisticated, and relentless, Persia had already swallowed vast territories across Asia. Its kings commanded staggering resources, enormous armies, and the loyalty or fear of countless subject peoples. Under King Darius, Persia had already tried to punish the Greeks for supporting revolt in Ionia. That campaign ended in humiliation at Marathon, where the Athenians pulled off one of the most astonishing victories in military history. But empires do not forget humiliation. And when Darius died, his son Xerxes inherited not only a throne, but a mission: to crush Greece once and for all. This would not be a raid. This would be an invasion on a scale the Greek world had never seen. As the Persians prepared, the Greeks faced a deadly truth: divided, they would be destroyed. And now, Sparta would be forced to decide. Would it lead, or would it watch Greece fall? For Leonidas, the question was no longer whether war was coming. It was whether men could be found who were willing to stand in its path. And if they could not be found, he would have to be one of them himself. By the time Leonidas became king of Sparta, the Greek world was trembling. Persia was not just powerful, it was overwhelming. Its wealth dwarfed that of the Greek city-states. Its manpower seemed endless. Its king ruled over lands so vast that to many Greeks, Persia felt less like a nation and more like a force of nature. And yet Leonidas was not a ruler who relied on speeches, vanity, or spectacle. He was something rarer, a man shaped by discipline so severe that fear no longer governed him. Still, becoming king did not mean becoming all-powerful. Sparta itself was a deeply traditional society, bound by law, ritual, and custom. Its kings led armies and carried enormous prestige, but they did not act alone. Power was shared with elders, magistrates, and the strict expectations of Spartan life. Leonidas also carried the burden of inheritance. He had married Gorgo, the daughter of the earlier Spartan king Cleomenes. She is often remembered as intelligent, politically aware, and sharp-minded, not merely a queen in the background, but someone who understood the gravity of the times. Through marriage and blood, Leonidas was tied to the continuity of Spartan rule, but none of that removed the storm gathering on the horizon. When Xerxes began his invasion of Greece around 480 BC, the scale of the threat was almost impossible to comprehend. Bridges were thrown across the Hellespont. Canals were cut through mountains. Food, ships, troops, engineers, cavalry, archers. Persia moved not like an army, but like a civilization in motion. And as news spread westwards, Greek cities reacted in familiar ways. Fear, argument, delay, selfish calculation. Some wanted to submit. Some hoped to survive by staying neutral. Some still clung to the fantasy that the Persians might be someone else's problem. But Leonidas understood something crucial. Tyranny rarely stops where it is invited. If Greece did not resist together, it would fall separately. This is one of the most important things about Leonidas, and one of the most misunderstood. He was not simply brave. Bravery alone is common in stories. What made him extraordinary was that he was brave with clarity. He understood the odds. He understood the politics. He understood that Greece's divisions might kill it before Persia even arrived. And yet he moved anyway. When the Greek alliance finally decided to block the Persian advance, a strategy emerged. Hold the land route at Thermopylae and contest the sea at Artemisium. Thermopylae was a narrow coastal pass, a gateway into central Greece. It was one of the few places where the Persian army's vast numbers could be constrained. If held properly, it could neutralize much of Persia's advantage. It was, in military terms, an intelligent choice. But there was a problem. At the very moment Greece most needed Sparta's full military strength, Sparta was restricted by religious observances and the Olympic truce. Large-scale mobilization was delayed. This is where Leonidas made the decision that would define his life. He marched anyway, not with the full Spartan army, but with a hand-picked royal guard of 300 Spartans, each chosen because he had a living son to carry on his family line. Think about that for a moment. This was not just a military unit. It was a force selected with the expectation of death. Leonidas was not going to Thermopylae because he believed he would sweep the Persians away. He was going because someone had to stand first. And perhaps that is what separates a king from a legend. A king may defend his throne. A legend defends an idea larger than himself. As Leonidas marched north, other Greeks joined him: Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Phocians, and more. In total, the Greek force numbered several thousand. Still tiny compared with Persia. Still terrifyingly exposed. But for the first time, Greece had something more valuable than numbers. It had a man willing to embody resistance. And as the dust of marching feet rose over the roads to Thermopylae, Leonidas was not just leading soldiers to a battlefield. He was leading them into history. Thermopylae means the hot gates. It is a place of narrow ground, mountain on one side, sea on the other, a strip of land so tight that numbers lose much of their power. For Leonidas, it was the perfect killing ground. For Xerxes, it was an obstacle that should have been crushed in hours. That is the thing about empires. They become so accustomed to being obeyed that resistance feels almost insulting. When Xerxes looked at the Greeks blocking the pass, he likely saw not a true threat, but an inconvenience. A few stubborn men standing in the path of inevitability. He was wrong. The standoff itself became legendary. According to tradition, when the Persians demanded that the Greeks lay down their weapons, Leonidas replied, "Molon lebe, come and take them." Whether polished by history or spoken exactly as remembered, the phrase has endured because it captures the essence of Leonidas perfectly. No panic, no pleading, no theatrics, just defiance, distilled into 4 syllables. For days, the Persian king waited, perhaps expecting the Greeks to flee at the sight of his army. But they did not run. So the attack began. Wave after wave of Persian troops surged into the pass. Medes, Scythians, elite formations, men from every corner of the empire, they advanced with confidence, numbers, and the authority of a world power behind them. And they were thrown back, again, and again, and again. The narrow terrain worked exactly as Leonidas intended. Greek hoplites fought in disciplined formation, shield against shield, spear against spear. In the confined space, Persian numbers became congestion. Their mobility was reduced. Their arrows and cavalry were far less effective. Their troops were forced into brutal close combat against some of the hardest infantry in Greece. And the Spartans, along with their allies, excelled in exactly that kind of fighting. This is important because Thermopylae is often presented simply as a heroic suicide mission. But that misses the brilliance of it. It was not blind sacrifice. It was intelligent resistance. Leonidas used terrain, discipline, and morale to multiply the effectiveness of a small army against a colossal one. For a time, he made the impossible possible. Even Xerxes' elite guard, the so-called immortals, struggled to break through. What was supposed to be a swift demonstration of Persian superiority became a humiliation in front of the entire invasion force. Imagine the psychological effect of that. An empire that believed itself unstoppable was being held in place by men who refused to bend. And on the Greek side, every hour mattered. Every day mattered. Because Thermopylae was not only about that narrow pass. It was about time. Time for the Greek alliance to organize. Time for morale to harden. Time for the naval struggle to continue. Time for Greece to believe that Persia could, in fact, be resisted. But history is rarely kind enough to allow perfection. There was a mountain path around the pass, and a local Greek named Ephialtes betrayed the defenders by revealing it to the Persians. That was the turning point. Once Leonidas learned that the Persians were moving to outflank the position, the battle changed entirely. This was no longer a contest of holding the gate. It was now a choice. Retreat and preserve the force, or remain, delay the Persians, and die. Leonidas chose to stay. But even that decision is richer than myth often makes it. He did not simply command everyone to die beside him for glory. He dismissed much of the Greek force. He gave many the chance to withdraw and continue the war. And then he remained with his Spartans, joined by other Greeks, who also chose not to leave, most famously the Thespians, whose courage deserves to be remembered alongside the Spartans. That final stand has echoed through the centuries because it speaks to something profoundly human, not the certainty of victory, but the dignity of choosing one's stand. Leonidas knew the end. He knew the pass was lost. He knew he would be surrounded and killed. But he also knew that the manner of his death could become a weapon. And so the last battle began. The Greeks fought with spears until the spears broke, then with swords. Then, according to the tradition, with hands and teeth if necessary. Leonidas himself was killed in the fighting, and a fierce struggle reportedly took place over his body. Eventually, the defenders were overwhelmed. The Persians won the field. But that is not the same thing as winning the moment. Because when Thermopylae ended, something had changed. Persia had advanced, but Greece had found its symbol. And symbols are dangerous things. Armies can kill men. They struggle to kill meaning. Leonidas had fallen, but his choice had become immortal. Most men are measured by outcomes. Did they win? Did they conquer? Did they survive? By those standards alone, Leonidas should have faded into a footnote. He died. His position was overrun. The Persians advanced deeper into Greece. Athens itself would soon be evacuated and burned. And yet, thousands of years later, the name most people remember is not Xerxes. It is Leonidas. Why? Because history is not shaped only by those who live longest or command the largest armies. It is shaped by those who crystallize an idea so powerfully that generations cannot let it go. Leonidas became that kind of figure. Thermopylae proved that Persia was not invincible. That alone mattered enormously. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. When facing overwhelming force, people often collapse before the real struggle even begins. They surrender mentally before they surrender physically. Leonidas interrupted that process. He gave Greece a model of resistance. After Thermopylae came Salamis, where the Greek fleet achieved a decisive naval victory. Then came Plataea, where Persian ambitions in mainland Greece were finally broken. Would those victories have happened exactly as they did without Thermopylae? We cannot know for certain, but we do know this: Leonidas helped buy time, rally resolve, and transform the emotional terrain of the war. That is not a small contribution. That is strategic influence of the highest order. But beyond the military consequences lies something even deeper. Leonidas became a story people told when they wanted to explain courage. Not comfort, not convenience, not easy confidence. Courage in its hardest form, the kind that acts even when the cost is known. This is why his legacy escaped ancient Greece and entered the wider imagination of the West. He represented a kind of moral clarity that later ages found irresistible. Stand when standing matters. Fight when fighting is necessary. Refuse submission when submission destroys what makes life worth living. Of course, myth also simplifies. The real Leonidas was not a comic book hero carved out of pure perfection. He was a Spartan king, shaped by a harsh and often brutal society. Sparta itself was deeply unequal, heavily dependent on the oppression of others, and far from an ideal state in any modern moral sense. That complexity matters. If we romanticize everything, we understand nothing. But understanding complexity does not require cynicism. We can recognize the cruelty of Spartan society, while still acknowledging the extraordinary force of Leonidas's final decision. And perhaps that tension makes his story even more compelling. He was not a saint. He was not a fantasy. He was a human being formed by a severe world, confronted by a terrible choice, and remembered because he met that choice with astonishing resolve. There is also another reason Leonidas endures. His story challenges modern assumptions about success. Today, we are taught to think in visible wins: money, status, domination, survival, scale. Leonidas forces a different question. What if success is not always measured by living? What if, in certain rare moments, success means acting so truthfully and so bravely that defeat itself becomes a form of victory? That is the power of his life. He reminds us that meaning is not reserved for the victorious. Sometimes, meaning belongs to those who refuse to betray themselves. And that is why artists, writers, filmmakers, and historians keep returning to Thermopylae. Not because it is a story about death, but because it is a story about what a life can mean when it is anchored in conviction. Leonidas did not save Greece alone. He did not destroy the Persian Empire. He did not live to see the final outcome. But he did something that very few people in all of history have ever done. He created a moment so powerful that it outlived the empire he stood against. So, what does Leonidas mean to us now? Why revisit a Spartan king who died nearly 2,500 years ago? Because his story is not really about ancient armor, bronze spears, or one narrow mountain pass. Those are the setting. The deeper story is about decision. There comes a moment in every life, though usually on a far smaller scale, when comfort and principle collide. A moment when silence is safer than honesty. When retreat is easier than responsibility. When compromise feels practical, even if it costs you your integrity. Most people will never face an invading empire. But everyone, in one form or another, faces Thermopylae. A narrow place. A hard choice. A line that feels dangerous to hold. And this is where Leonidas still speaks across time. He reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision that something else matters more. Duty, honor, freedom, loyalty, responsibility, truth. Pick the word that fits your life. The principle remains the same. What made Leonidas extraordinary was not that he was fearless. It was that he had ordered his soul around values stronger than fear. And that is deeply relevant now, perhaps more than ever. We live in an age of distraction, convenience, and endless noise. An age where people are often encouraged to optimize, protect their image, avoid discomfort, and keep every option open. Leonidas represents the opposite energy: commitment, discipline, sacrifice, the willingness to stand for something fully. Now, that does not mean glorifying death, violence, or blind stubbornness. And it certainly does not mean pretending that every fight is noble. It means understanding that the most meaningful lives are rarely built on comfort alone. They are built on choices that cost something, on standards kept when no one forces you to keep them, on responsibility accepted when excuses would be easier, on resolve held when the outcome is uncertain. That is why Leonidas still inspires. Not because we should imitate Sparta, but because we recognize, at a human level, the beauty of steadfastness. We admire people who do not run from what matters. People who absorb pressure and remain true. People who show, in action rather than slogans, what conviction looks like. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy of Leonidas. He turned resistance into an example. He showed that even when the outcome is grim, the way you meet the moment matters. He proved that one person's refusal to yield can strengthen countless others. He demonstrated that courage can travel further than armies. When Leonidas stood at Thermopylae, he could not know exactly how history would remember him. He could not know that his name would survive in books, films, classrooms, speeches, and memory across millennia. All he could know was the choice before him. And maybe that is the final lesson. We do not control how history judges us. We do not control how long our names endure. We do not control whether life rewards every noble act. But we do control this. When the narrow place comes, when the pressure closes in, when the easy path asks us to bow, will we stand? Leonidas answered that question with his life. That is why we still speak his name.
Leonidas did not become immortal because he lived forever. He became immortal because, in a single defining moment, he chose principle over survival, duty over fear, and meaning over safety. And maybe that is why his story still matters. Because somewhere in your life, there is a line only you can hold. If this story moved you, then don't let it end here. Subscribe for more deep, cinematic stories from history's greatest lives. Like the video if you believe courage still matters. And in the comments, tell me this. What was Leonidas's greatest strength, his leadership, his sacrifice, or his refusal to surrender? And if there's another legendary figure you want next, write the name below. Because history is not dead. It is waiting to be remembered. Thanks for watching,